Imagine this. China and Europe join forces in a super plan to conquer the United States. Their military strategies are flawless. Their economic plans are perfectly aligned. Their communication is instantaneous. Victory seems inevitable, and nothing can go wrong. Until the United States makes one simple move. It cuts a wire. Suddenly, Europe and China fall into chaos. Their military forces are cut off from communication. Banks collapse because they can't access global markets. Governments can't issue orders. Their societies descend into panic, and in a matter of days, their grand plan falls apart. Communication between the two continents vanishes, and just like that, Europe and China are helpless. This isn't science fiction. It's a scenario that could unfold in real life, and it all hinges on one crucial piece of infrastructure that most people rarely think about: submarine cables. When we talk about global communication, most people think of satellites. They imagine information bouncing through space, connecting continents in seconds. But the truth is far less glamorous. Over 95% of all international internet traffic, whether it's emails, financial transactions, phone calls, or military communications, doesn't travel through the air. It travels underwater, through a sprawling network of submarine cables laid on the ocean floor. These cables are the invisible threads that tie the modern world together. Without them, the internet as we know it wouldn't function. Economies would collapse, military operations would grind to a halt, and entire nations could be plunged into darkness. There are currently more than 450 of these cables crisscrossing the oceans, stretching over 1.3 million kilometers. That's enough cable to circle the Earth over 30 times. But here's the thing. Despite being vital to the modern world, these cables are incredibly vulnerable. Now, back to our original scenario. Imagine the United States is facing a coordinated attack from China and Europe. While tanks and missiles may seem like the primary weapons of war, in this scenario, one of the most powerful weapons at the US's disposal is the ability to cut submarine cables. These cables are not buried deep in the ocean. In fact, many of them lie relatively close to the surface, making them easy targets for sabotage or military action. If the US wanted to cripple China and Europe, it could sever the cables that connect them to the rest of the world. With these cables cut, Europe and China would lose access to international communication networks. Their financial systems, which rely on instant communication with global markets, would be thrown into disarray. Stock markets would crash, banks would close, and millions of businesses would be unable to function. But it's not just about economics. Cutting these cables would also have devastating effects on military operations. Modern militaries rely on secure communication channels to coordinate movements, control drones, and share intelligence. With no way to communicate across continents, military forces in Europe and China would be operating blind. Commanders couldn't issue orders, troops couldn't receive updates, and operations would fall apart. This is how a nation can effectively cripple another without firing a single shot. The United States isn't the only country that could exploit this vulnerability. In fact, any country with access to the ocean could theoretically cut off another nation's communications by targeting its submarine cables. For example, Russia has been known to explore this tactic. Russia has a submarine fleet that is capable of tracking and potentially severing these cables. In recent years, NATO and other Western nations have raised concerns about the increasing presence of Russian submarines near critical communication cables. If Russia were to cut the cables connecting Europe to the United States, it would isolate the continent from its allies, leaving Europe vulnerable to military and economic chaos. Similarly, China could use this tactic against its regional rivals, like Japan or South Korea. Both nations are heavily reliant on submarine cables for their communication with the rest of the world. A well-placed attack on these cables could cripple their economies and disrupt their military alliances. In fact, during times of conflict, one of the first moves a nation might make is to cut these cables to isolate its enemies. This tactic has been used in the past. During World War I, the British Empire cut Germany's undersea telegraph cables, severely limiting Germany's ability to communicate with its allies and colonies. To understand the full potential impact of cutting these cables, let's take a closer look at the network itself. As we mentioned earlier, there are over 450 submarine cables connecting the world. These cables carry a staggering amount of data every second. The world's largest cables can transmit over 160 terabits of data per second. That's enough to send thousands of HD movies across the ocean every second. But the problem is, many regions of the world are heavily dependent on just a handful of these cables. For example, the United States is connected to Europe primarily through a few major cables in the North Atlantic. If these cables were cut, the two continents would be effectively isolated from each other. Asia, too, has its own vulnerabilities. Many of the cables connecting Asia to the rest of the world pass through the South China Sea, a region already known for its geopolitical tensions. In the event of a conflict, these cables could be easily targeted, cutting off entire nations from global communication. In fact, there are regions where just one or two cables are the lifeline for an entire continent. Africa, for example, is heavily reliant on a handful of submarine cables to maintain its connections to Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Severing these cables would plunge the entire continent into a communications blackout. So, how exactly could a nation go about cutting these cables? While they're built to be durable and withstand the harsh conditions of the ocean floor, they are not indestructible. Submarine cables are typically made of several layers of protective material, including steel wire and plastic, but at their core, they're only about the size of a garden hose. This makes them vulnerable to a number of threats. One of the most common causes of cable damage is fishing activity. Ships dragging large nets along the ocean floor can accidentally snag and break cables. Natural disasters, like earthquakes and underwater landslides, can also damage cables. But deliberate sabotage is another matter entirely. A nation could deploy submarines or underwater drones equipped with tools to locate and sever these cables. Some cables are buried under the seabed in shallow areas to protect them from ships and other threats. But in deep waters, they are often left exposed. This makes them an easy target for any nation with a capable navy or access to advanced underwater technology. In some cases, it wouldn't even require a nation-state to cut these cables. Terrorist organizations or private actors could potentially damage or destroy submarine cables, causing widespread disruption. The consequences of cutting these cables would be catastrophic. The global economy relies on instant communication, and submarine cables are the arteries of that system. If a major cable between continents were cut, stock markets would crash, and international trade would grind to a halt. Banks would struggle to process international transactions, and businesses that rely on real-time data would suffer massive losses. But beyond the economic fallout, the political consequences would be just as severe. In today's interconnected world, communication is power. Governments rely on constant communication with their allies, and military operations are dependent on secure and reliable information channels. If these cables were cut, nations would be left vulnerable, unable to coordinate their defenses or respond to threats. Imagine a scenario where Europe is isolated from the United States. Without communication, NATO would struggle to coordinate any military response to a threat from Russia. Similarly, China, cut off from its trading partners, would see its economy falter as markets plummeted and supply chains collapsed. In the modern world, the most powerful weapons aren't always missiles or tanks. Sometimes, They're the invisible systems that make global communication possible. Submarine cables are one of the most critical pieces of infrastructure on the planet, and yet they are also some of the most vulnerable. If the United States, or any other nation, wanted to cripple its rivals, it wouldn't need to engage in a direct military confrontation. It could simply cut a wire. And with that, entire economies could collapse, military alliance would be shattered, and nations would be thrown into chaos. It's a sobering thought, but one that highlights just how interconnected and fragile our world has become. The next time you send an email, make a phone call, or check your bank balance, remember, all of that information is traveling through cables lying on the ocean floor. And in the event of a conflict, those cables could become the first targets. And what do you think of all this? Did you know about the existence and importance of these submarine cables? Let me know with a comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more future content.